I mean, it looked ridiculous. It was a huge failure, but it was because it got caught up in this story, and it was just too good a story. And the editor of the newspaper was so intent on breaking news and getting scoops and winning prizes. We have alternate sources today. We have, we have sources that are so influential as individuals, Joe Rogan, or YouTubers, Russell Brand, with his like insane YouTube following, like 10 million, which is for sure bigger than whatever the New York Times has on YouTube. What about all the other wars that have been going on around the world? I mean, there are many wars that are being waged today that we hear nothing about.
Hi, Ashley. It's great to see you here. I would like to start basically asking you about a little bit more about your background, where you worked and what you do currently, and a little bit more about what made you write the book, The Gray Lady Winked.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm sort of involved in a number of different things. I studied philosophy at college, and I also studied the history and sociology of science. And then I was sort of drifting. After college, I went to work in the Internet Archive, which is the guys that do the Wayback Machine, and Brewster Kahle, run by Brewster Kahle, who's the founder of Alexa Internet, and created the archive, which basically is devoted to scraping the entire web and saving every internet, every web page. So I was there for a while, a year and a half, 2 years, and then I got very tired of it and found a job as a deckhand on a sailing yacht in the Mediterranean. I love to sail. I wanted to do something a little different, so I went sailing, and that took me onward eventually to Israel, where I ended up in Tel Aviv for good 13, 14 years. We were watching the transformation of Tel Aviv from this very small town, basically, into a global hotspot for tech, for culture, food. It literally happened in front of my eyes. So that's kind of my quick and dirty background. And now I got to the point where I wrote this book about the New York Times, because I got a sense that things are not always what they seem with the media. And the New York Times is the symbol of the legacy media. It's the flagship of the media fleet. And I came across some information about the New York Times when I was in Tel Aviv, reading some history books. I wanted to confirm it, and that kind of took me down this rabbit hole of thinking about the New York Times. So I wrote that book. It came out in May 2021. It was kind of a runaway hit, a surprise, a sleeper, as they say, because like I didn't really expect it to sell that well. I thought it was kind of this niche topic, but it just really hit hard. And then now I'm doing quite a lot of journalism. I'm covering stuff related to pandemic, some of the narratives that have been spun around the pandemic, particularly by China and also by other governments. And also just covering media, because I think we all have the sense that media is like the center of our lives today. And we all know it's facing a lot of problems and challenges. Some are economic, some are more to do with how is media relate to the world, that in today's world where media is just a constant stream that we get through all social media. So we're all addicted to media almost every waking moment. But the news media feels like it's kind of lagging behind by about 20, 30 years in so many different ways. So I'm thinking a lot about media. I'm setting out on a media tech project, and still continuing with some of the journalism and, of course, other kind of writing and Substack, just to sort of stay on top of really fast cycle stories like that.
That's great, and that's super interesting to hear. So let's dive in a little bit more on the New York Times, and why did you choose to cover it? Can you give us a sense of what the New York Times represented, in the past 50 years? Like, why specifically, the New York Times compared, to other media channels, other newspapers or TV channels?
Sure. The Times is like it's like the apex predator of the American legacy media. It's the top of the food chain. It is upstream of everything. Um, you know, it says all the news that's fit to print on its daily edition, and that was true for a long time. Like if it was in the New York Times, it was automatically considered news because the Times covered it. And the opposite, the vice versa was true as well. That if the Times didn't cover it, it wasn't really news. So if you wrote a book or made a movie or staged a ballet or created a business or whatever it might be, and the Times didn't pay attention to you, it was like you just weren't important, especially in the arts. And that was something that I found really interesting, that you have disproportionate power, not just in the American media, but across the world, because the Times both syndicates and licenses content to thousands, literally thousands of news outlets around the world. And it also owns a number of news subsidiaries around the world and has branches still today in a number of countries, and including in China, I believe in Spain and Europe, and in Israel, they have a partnership. So it's got this enormous influence, and it's got a myth that's even bigger than its actual influence. It's something that, a news brand, if you think of like what other news brand could you go to, like dozens of countries around the world, say the news brand, and people will be like, oh yeah, I've heard of that. There's almost nothing like it. Maybe the BBC, because the BBC does the long wave radio stuff, so it reaches like all corners of the world, literally. But the New York Times has its own special ring to it. And so that kind of like already caught my interest. Like, why is it so powerful? What does that mean? What does that do to the media ecosystem? And then the other question is, of course, like, does it live up to the myth of its brand, that if the New York Times prints it, that it's true? That's quite a bold claim, and the New York Times actually makes that claim. Their most recent marketing campaign over the last 5 years is the Truth campaign, Truth Matters. And they're essentially making themselves synonymous with the truth, which again is bold. It might be even audacious, or it might even be beyond that for a news organization to make that claim. I think borders on the dangerous, but they do make that claim. And that's the kind of thing you want to check on. And, in my case, I was reading this book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer. It's a great book of history by a journalist who was there at the time during the events, during the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And he kind of mentions in part of that book in a footnote that when hostilities broke out during World War II, the New York Times lead story for that day, which would have been September 1st, 1939, sort of reprinted a Nazi propaganda claim, which was that Poland had invaded Germany and the Germans were just kind of responding to Polish aggression, which is ridiculous. Like, it's just a patently, not only is it historically false, but by that point of 10 years of hardcore aggressive Nazi propaganda, any journalist for sure would have known that's just a lie, and it would have likely been a Nazi propaganda effort, which it was. It was actually called Operation Himmler. It was the Nazis created this plot to make it look as if Polish guerrilla fighters had invaded a radio station in Germany at the border, Gleiwitz. They took POWs out of German camps. They dressed them up as German civilians. They killed them first, then they dressed them up, and they put them in this radio station. And they made it look as if Polish guerrillas had killed all these German, quote unquote, German civilians. They were not German civilians, and then they sold that to the world. So most of the world, I think, would realize by that point that the Nazis were very good at propaganda. This was after the Nazi Olympics, the Berlin Games of 1936. This was after many years of Nazi lying flat out, of course, persecution of Jews and other minorities. And to print this claim in the New York Times that on its lead story the day after the outbreak of hostilities was quite something to do, especially for a liberal New York Times newspaper, liberal Jewish owned at the time newspaper. So that got me thinking, how did that happen? Why did that happen? What else happened that was along those lines? How deep does this go? And that was The Gray Lady Winked, was born out of the book I wrote about the Times, which is looking at 10 different major historical instances where the New York Times, they didn't just get the story wrong. That happens all the time. That's just natural in anything, right? Journalism, medicine, whatever. It's that they almost willfully distorted history in these cases because they were warned. In this case as well, in the case of their treatment of the Nazis, they kind of knew what was going on, and what was actually going on there was they had a Nazi sympathizer running their Berlin bureau, and he was printing this stuff for many years. And the New York Times management, they were aware of that. So again and again, that's the pattern. The New York Times was really doing these very strangely aggressive distortions of history, and each chapter covers one of them. It goes into Stalin Russia and the cover up of the Ukraine famine in the early 1930s, the rise of Fidel Castro in Cuba, the Vietnam War, the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, which the New York Times, in collaboration with the American War Department, at the time was called the War Department, worked to deny that there was such a thing as radiation poisoning, which was, of course, a lie. And then a few other instances, including the Iraq War, which was a very infamous case, some stuff in Israel and the Palestinian territories, and right up until today with the 1619 Project, which is sort of a falsification, this false myth about American history that the New York Times has built and seeded into the world.
Interesting. So let's dive in a little bit more into, what happened in Nazi Germany. I mean, it's very weird that, a newspaper that advertises and portrays an image of itself saying, oh, we portrayed the truth, didn't report what was happening, in Germany, especially in 1939, right? And that was like when I guess around when the war started, but the movement started much earlier. So like, why did the New York Times report such a propaganda from Germany? Like maybe they didn't know. Let's play the devil's advocate here. What was happening there? Why did they not report what was going on, what was actually going on?
That's kind of a general question people ask me all the time, which they say to me, if the New York Times did all this crazy stuff, and some of it truly was crazy, then how did it stay number one for so long? How did it get this great reputation for being the best? And my response is that it got the reputation for being the best by doing the crazy stuff. That's what people miss, is like, in order to be number one, in order to stay number one in anything for that amount of time, you need to be ruthless, right? New York Times is a business. It's a $10 billion company. It's got billions of dollars in annual revenue. It has a stock price that they need to maintain. Being number one in that business means getting the best access to sources, getting the fastest and the biggest scoops, and it means having celebrity journalists, really famous journalists, bringing the news. At least some of them, not all of them. And none of that has to do with the truth necessarily, right? It's those three things. You don't have to tell the truth in order to do those three things. And sometimes doing those three things means not telling the truth necessarily, because those things about speed, getting the story first, getting the biggest stories, getting the best sources, and getting the most famous journalists, they kind of push out the truth. They kind of cram out the truth, because the truth sometimes is very mild-mannered, and very kind of shy. And when you're this big, loud machine, it's like you almost scare the truth off. So in this case, they had in the 1930s, the man running their bureau, the Nazi sympathizer that I mentioned, his name was Guido Enderes. And he was known by other journalists, by the Nazis themselves, and by the New York Times to be a sympathizer of the Nazi cause, which meant that the Nazis loved him. They would read his news reports out on German radio broadcasts without editing them because they were so favorable to the Germans. And the Germans gave him really good access to their top sources because they knew that he would make them look good, right? So you're getting great access, you're getting great scoops, you're getting huge stories, and you're running a bureau with a couple other really well-known journalists at the time. So you've fulfilled all those three criteria of staying number one, and you have in that instance really just trampled on the truth, and that didn't matter. So when it came to their attention, it was actually a sort of junior editor in New York, a Jewish guy, who came to the management and said, "Listen, you guys have a Nazi running your Berlin bureau. This can't go on anymore." Then they said to him, "You better shut your mouth, otherwise you're going to be slapped with a libel lawsuit." And he did, of course. When you're being threatened like that by the New York Times, you are going to shut your mouth. So that was what kept them number one. It was their willingness to keep a Nazi in place because he was getting, or Nazi collaborator or sympathizer in place because he was getting them the best stories. He was getting them scoops, and they couldn't have switched him out and replaced him with somebody as able as he was to get that kind of reporting. So that's like a really great example of how being ruthless and willing to sacrifice on honesty and willing to sacrifice on the ideal of bringing true, hard facts to people help them stay in the number one position in the news market. And again, I return to that idea. This is a market. We're not dealing in like this lofty sphere of angelic beings who are reporters. These people work for large companies like the New York Times or like NBC News or what have you, which today are all owned by large parent conglomerates, and they are running a business or trying to. So I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind.
So I think you mentioned that that was more a business decision than, necessarily a bias that they had. But did they actually think did they downplay what was happening in Germany? Because, I mean, even if it was a business decision, right, it seems like a very cold decision to let it not reported correctly,
Yeah, well, there was two things going on. One was the playing up not the Nazi perspective in Germany. So they were really being sympathetic to the Nazis in a way that was very favorable to Germany, and that won the New York Times lots of access to German officials in the reporting. It was very good for the reporting. So, you can say you make these decisions on the fly. If you're the publisher of the New York Times, you're in the middle of this great war, Second World War, and you're thinking, this guy is who we've got. We don't know who we could find to replace him. We have to have someone reporting from Germany. And just so happens he's really great at it because he's getting great stories. So let's just keep him in place. What are we going to do? Like, we have no choice, really. So let's just keep him there. The Holocaust thing that you mentioned is, referencing the idea that they didn't cover the Holocaust. 6 front page stories in 6 years. That's insane when you think about the most consequential genocide up until that point in the modern era by far. And the first mechanized genocide in history. Everybody knew it was happening by that point. There was no question about the veracity, but the Times was facing they were facing a business environment that they felt was unfavorable to them being seen as a Jewish newspaper because they were owned by a Jewish family. And there was rising anti-Semitism in New York at the time, just as there is today. And they were worried about being seen they were in this period where they were establishing the brand. The brand wasn't as established then as now, and they didn't want to be accused of being a Jewish newspaper that was advocating for Jewish causes. So that was something that was partially a business decision, of course, and at the same time, and this is kind of answers your question, is like, how do you make such a drastic decision? It's very cold if it's only business, but it wasn't only business. it was also ideological, because they came from a certain brand of German Jewry that just happened to believe that Jews are not, the Jewish people are not actually a people, not a nation or an ethnicity, but it's just a manner of worship. And this was something that was born out of a lot of biblical theory and biblical studies that was going on in Germany in the late 19th century, where German scholars were starting to categorize religion in a very certain way. So they wanted to fit things neatly in boxes, as Germans tend to do, especially German scholars. So they said, okay, well, we have Christianity as a form of worship, and you can have Canadian Christians, and you can have Indian Christians, and you can have any kind of nation or ethnicity can also be a Christian. And the same goes with Muslims. And the same is not necessarily true with Jews. It's kind of a different category, but it didn't fit into the categorization. So these German scholars of the Bible and religion kind of forced this new understanding of what the Jewish people are, and even coined the term Judaism, which really wasn't something that was in circulation until that point. And the New York Times came from that philosophy to say, there's no such thing as Jewish people. There are just people. There are French people, there are German people, there are American people. Some worship in churches and some worship in synagogues. It's not a difference. So to say that the Germans were killing lots of Jews was like an empty category, didn't mean anything to them. This was like such an ideological reach, but they really believed it. And partially they believed it because they believed they were Americans. They didn't want to be seen as Jews in America. They wanted to be seen as Americans who worshiped in a synagogue and not in a church. And this also applied to their understanding of immigration at the time. They were staunchly anti-Jewish immigration to America. They really opposed it vocally in the paper because, again, they thought, why would we allow Jewish refugees into the country specifically? There was no Jewish category. It didn't mean anything when you had talked about a Jewish refugee as opposed to some other German refugee or some other French or Belgian refugee from Europe at the time. There was no reason in their eyes to allow that. So you put that together with the business interest, that being not being seen as a Jewish newspaper by the American public, and then you just have like this overwhelming case for them to not cover the Holocaust, which in a way was not something that in their eyes that happened. And they even went so far as to not allow editors to use the word Jew in their newspaper, except in like absolutely necessary cases, like you just linguistically can't avoid it. They also prevented Jews from, and again, bear in mind, this is a Jewish-owned newspaper. They prevented Jews from rising to top positions on the masthead, top editorial positions. And this is a long and fairly well-studied phenomenon at the New York Times. And it's, this is just the Jewish part. There are other minorities that have been discriminated against, including women. But this was one of the most shameful of the episodes because it's so blatant and because it's so almost unbelievable.
Interesting. And at the time, so they were against Jewish immigration, or were they against immigration in general? Which one of
both,
them, sir?
But mostly Jewish. Mm-hmm. They were very vocal about being against Jewish immigration specifically.
Mm-hmm. And what was the argument then?
The argument was that there was no reason to allow so-called Jews, meaning Europeans who worshipped in Jewish places of worship, because then you would say, why not just let all of Europe into America, right? You had tens of millions of people who were trying to escape war in Europe and would have happily come to America, the land of prosperity at the time, and still is today for many people around the world, and say, why not just let everybody in at that point? Because there was no specific reason to allow Jewish people in, because in their minds, there was no real meaningful category of Jew. So there was no, you were going to limit immigration anyway. The American public was opposed to more immigration from Europe So with the limitations already imposed, they wouldn't make a special exception for Jews because it just, for them, it had no meaning, didn't carry any water.
And did that affect public opinion at the time about the war, or about immigration, or how did that affect the public?
Yeah, you think like this was the most powerful and influential newspaper, or at least one of the top two or three in the United States and around the world. They had such a great reach. And we know today, we know what it's like. I always talk about, we talk about media bias. And generally when we talk about bias, we talk about what's in the news. But the much more effective bias tool is what is left out of the news, what is not covered. We've heard about this a lot with the Ukraine war, right? We've had this war being broadcast to us in newspapers and podcasts. It's all over the media all the time, at least it has been for the last few months. What about all the other wars that have been going on around the world? I mean, there are many wars that are being waged today that we hear nothing about. We hear nothing about wars on the African continent, nothing, very, very little about the war that's been raging in Yemen for a number of years. And that is a kind of bias. So if it's not being covered by the major news sources of the day, then it's as if it doesn't exist. And when you come to the American people and say, what about this terrible thing that's going on in Europe? And they say, what are you talking about? That's not a thing. And I think there's also this kind of echo chamber effect where the Times doesn't cover something, and it being the New York Times, this important newspaper, and other newspapers could have been more likely to say, how important is it? Other papers did, of course, cover it. And many of these other examples that I speak about in The Gray Lady Winked, for example, the New York Times really celebrated the 1936 Berlin Olympics, the Nazi Olympics, where Hitler was using the Olympics to show off German racial superiority and organizational abilities, etc. And the New York Times' big feature story from the games, the headline read, "The greatest sporting event of all times," whereas the Washington Post and other newspapers were saying this was a catastrophe because it allowed the Nazis to stage their propaganda to the world and for people around the world to eat it up. So there were sort of counter examples to the Times and counterweights to the Times' reporting, but there was always going to be an impact when you have a newspaper is so powerful, so connected to the levers of power. And in the next chapter in the book, chapter 2, which is about the New York Times' again, non-coverage of the Ukraine famine of 1931, 1932, it's as if it didn't exist. It wasn't in the New York Times. And the New York Times' correspondent who covered up the famine deliberately, Walter Duranty, an infamous figure from journalism, he was personally advising Franklin Delano Roosevelt on matters of state, on geopolitical matters. So you have this guy saying Stalin did not kill 5 to 10 million people. That's the line he's putting out into the world, and not just into the world, into general public opinion, but to the people who are holding power in their very hands. Roosevelt being the most powerful man in the world at that point when he became president shortly after. So that had a huge effect when you've got that much influence among political power players, media, and of course the public, the news consuming public, an enormous impact.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess you talked a little bit about USSR. Can you also talk a little bit about the Cuban Revolution, maybe, and what happened there, and why? Like, how did the New York Times cover that as well?
Yeah, it's another great example of the Times' influence. What happened was that it was around, I believe, 1957, that Fidel Castro was on the brink of extinction. He was irrelevant. The Batista government regime was not even looking for him anymore. He was hiding out in the mountains of Cuba and down to his last men, very few weapons, almost no money, not a player, not a relevant figure. He was then rediscovered by a New York Times reporter named Herbert Matthews, Matthews was like this very romantic figure. He'd spent time with Hemingway in Spain and in Ethiopia during what was called the Abyssinian War, and really loved Hemingway's flair for romance. And Herbert Matthews was really caught up in this stuff. And he was also very close with the New York Times publisher at that time. So Herbert Matthews trumps into Cuba, goes up to the mountains and finds Castro and writes this very romantic story about the whole experience. And overnight, Castro is transformed. And it didn't stop there, though. And of course, one article would never be enough to make a myth out of sort of a lonely rebel. It was a series of stories on and on and on, over and over and over, with Herbert Matthews becoming almost increasingly breathless about his take on Castro, that Castro was this democratic savior of Cuba, that he was the messiah of democracy come to Cuba to free them from the Batista regime. And of course, it was true that Batista regime was repressive and was a dictatorship, obviously. But we know that what came after was probably much worse for most people in Cuba than what was before, because Castro turned out to be, essentially authoritarian figure in Cuba. But that's not what the public was sold by the New York Times. And the New York Times had this ability to take this man, literally pluck him out of the forest in the mountains and put him onto the world stage. And it was after that, only a couple of years before the revolution was a success, in 1959, 1960. And Castro literally went to New York, his first visit to America as the ruler of Cuba, and went to the New York Times building on Times Square at that time in history, and thanked the publisher and Herbert Matthews for what they had done for him. Che Guevara is on record saying that the New York Times and Herbert Matthews did more for the movement, for Castro's movement, than any frontline commander. It's just, you can't calculate that, because when you catapult a figure like that onto the world stage, and this is in the context of the Cold War, and the Soviets are paying attention and saying, hold on a second, we have an enormous opportunity here with this guy. And it didn't take them long to really figure out how to leverage that opportunity, which is exactly what they did. So without that notoriety, without that star power, Castro very well just could have faded away into history, but that's actually not what happened, of course.
Why did they do it? Why did they put him on a pedestal?
It was one of these things where it was down to this individual journalist whose flair for the romantic story got the better of him. And I don't think there was any sinister intention. I do think there was a lot of buy-in to the myth of a socialist paradise by the New York Times. It was considerably later than the reporting by Walter Duranty in the 1930s, but right after the Soviet Revolution, the New York Times really started publishing a lot of propaganda about socialism and communism in particular. They really were, and including by actual propagandists. One of these people, her name was Ella Winter, and she was actually an official propagandist for the Soviet regime, whose job was to spread the good word that you have this workers' paradise in Russia now. So I think there was this kind of influence at the Times, and certainly in New York, among this sort of liberal intelligentsia that was running the show, the cultural show in New York. There would have been that kind of strain, that influence on editors, and maybe even on the publisher. to really have that kind of sympathy for this leftist politics. But I think what really started it was Herbert Matthews' love of the story and his relationship with the publisher, which was a little too close. The publisher was actually giving him personal loans, stuff that really shouldn't have been happening. There was a lot of violation of journalistic standards and norms in that case, where, for example, he was a reporter, but he was also on the editorial board. That's something that shouldn't have happened at the time. And we're seeing that kind of stuff today as well, where you're watching big newspapers, the New York Times among them, the Washington Post among them, allowing stars to get away with violations of norms and standards that most rank and file reporters wouldn't get away with if they dared to attempt them. I recently actually yesterday came out an article about Taylor Lorenz, who is a Washington Post internet culture reporter, and she's a star. And I guess you know who she is, or you've heard about her. She was at the New York Times before, and she's been caught out doing stuff that really, if a rank and file reporter did it, they would be fired on the spot. For example, she in a story she did recently about YouTube video creators who were doing content on the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, she claimed that she reached out to two of them for comment, the two that were at the center of her article about this phenomenon, and both of them came out later and said no one ever reached out to us. And Lorenz sort of rewired the narrative to say, "Oh, I reached out to them after the story had gone live," which was also a falsehood. It was not true, and that's the kind of thing where a journalist would normally be disciplined or put on leave or subject to a formal probe or fired. And that doesn't really seem to have happened with Taylor because she's a star. And that was the same thing with Guido Andaris, the guy running the Berlin Bureau that we talked about. He was a star. That was the same thing about Walter Duranty, who was covering up the Ukraine famine. He was a superstar. He was the most famous journalistic figure of that moment. The New York Times would write articles about him, not just by him. And that's what happens when these standards start to slip and you start putting your business priorities above your news-making priorities and your standards as a news organization, and not your need for profit as a business. Those two things often clash with each other, and it's a really difficult decision for an organization to decide today, what's our identity? Is it a business today where we're putting profit first, or is it a news organization today where we're going to have to sacrifice profit in order to stick to our principles and advance our understanding of integrity? So this is something that is one of these eternal tensions in journalism and in other fields too, but certainly in journalism. And what we see is that often the tension kind of gets pulled too far in the one way. In Herbert Matthews' case, there were just too many overriding interests. It was too good a story. It was selling newspapers. He was friends with the publisher. He had too much leeway. And that's what happens is it gets too far gone. It got to the point with Matthews that the United States Senate started to hold hearings to look at his impact, because he was having an impact that was obviously creating this new figure on the international scene. The New York Times, with a bunch of other magazine and newspaper editors, arranged to bring Castro to New York for his first visit to America as Cuba's new leader. And what that did was that it preempted the State Department from doing that in an official capacity. So if it had been done through the State Department, they would have been able to organize formal meetings between Castro and American officials that would have been given them an ability to establish ties. But Castro came with these news editors to America, and that also had a damaging impact. So, things get out of control with media because media loves a good story. And when it gets a good story, that kind of like obviates everything else. It outshines every other consideration. They get so caught up in it, like with the weapons of mass destruction story, where the New York Times was trying to thought it had found evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and was sort of corroborating the Bush administration's claims that there were WMDs in Iraq, and there never were. And the New York Times, I mean, it looked ridiculous. It was a huge failure, but it was because it got caught up in this story, and it was just too good a story. And the editor of the newspaper was so intent on breaking news and getting scoops and winning prizes, and what he called increasing the newspaper's competitive metabolism, that the story ran away with them. And that's often what happens.
Interesting. Can you give a little bit more context of what was going on in Iraq? Like, what happened there? Why did they report that there were WMDs? Who was involved in giving that information? It was known at the time that Saddam Hussein, right, was probably negotiating selling oil through Russian rubles, and at the time, the U.S., had a major interest in maintaining the petrodollar, meaning selling oil through dollar, and the dollar has a huge influence. But what other players had an influence there? That is, the what they call the military-industrial complex, and other organizations inside the government. Why did that story came about, and what failures happened there?
I think that was a case where, again, the New York Times is kind of like stepping into this new chapter. They're at this point in time where they're starting to see that the news industry is at a turning point. It's now, around 2000, the internet is rising, their business model is changing, and it's not what it used to be. We used to be like really clear cut. If you lived in New York, you bought one of three newspapers. Most likely it was going to be the New York Times if you were a certain kind of person. That was starting to shift, and the Times was starting to develop a strategy that would sort of transcend its role as a New York or as a Northeast American newspaper to become a national newspaper, truly national. And that meant you got to appeal to a different kind of reader. It couldn't just be the squishy lefties. It had to also be the people in the center of the country. And they brought on this editor, the top editor, executive editor, whose name was Howell Raines. And Raines was kind of this red-blooded guy, and he comes out with these like very bold claims about, we're going to make this a national newspaper. We're going to, as I said before, increase the competitive metabolism of the paper. And we don't care if that means offending liberal sensibilities. We're going after the story. We're going after the meat. And you come in with this like really aggressive take on what kind of paper they're going to be. And again, here we hear the echoes of this sort of business imperative. We're going to pursue this from a business standpoint to be number one. And what that meant was that they were suddenly number one in sort of overdrive looking for stories. They were really intent not to lose stories to the Washington Post. And number two, that they also were like, they said, we're not going to, if it put us in the same court as the Bush administration, we're going to be okay with that. And that was like an overcompensation in a way, because when it came to this story, this was the biggest story of that period. We just gone through 9/11, right? Okay, so that was the biggest story up until that point. And after 9/11, the big question everybody was talking about, everybody, because Bush was launched the war, was attempting to launch this war. And the justification for the war in Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. It was, why are we going to fight a war against some dictator in a country that no one had really thought too much about since the last war in Iraq in the 1990s? Why are we doing this? Well, because he can give chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, and biological weapons to terrorists and kill Americans. So yeah, we have to go and take care of the problem, of course. That all depended on the question of if there were indeed WMDs in Iraq. And that was what everyone wanted to know. It's not a good story to say, no, there weren't. That's not a story. You say, no, there weren't. Okay, let's move on to the next day's news. Not very exciting. It is a great story to say, yes, there are. and to be the newspaper that found the evidence of it. And it put them in this space where they were too eager to believe it, because it really aligned up so beautifully with their business interest, which was, again, stay number one, increase your competitive metabolism, sort of perform this pivot, this inflection that from being left-wing, upper crust intelligentsia newspaper to newspaper for the whole country. And they were sort of led down a rabbit's hole. They were led down this path by bad actors who had their own interests at heart. There were many interests. I think lots of them were just people who were out to make a name for themselves, make money for themselves, and they fell for it. And they fell for it in a very embarrassing way, because the evidence was so weak. I mean, one of the key stories of the WMD affair was written by Judy Miller. She's sort of the person most closely associated with this scandal. And she is saying that she has got a source standing 100 feet away from her in the desert in Iraq, pointing to the ground, saying, this is where some of the components were buried over here. She could not speak to the guy. She could not ask him any questions. She could not even approach him. She didn't even know who he was. And that's kind of one of those moments where an editor would say, of course, we're not going to use that. That's not a source. That's just nothing. And that they made the other choice to say, let's run with it. And that's that moment that comes down to that real moment where an editor is making a decision, or a group of editors, and they made a decision to say, let's take this insane risk and achieve our goals, rather than stick to really true and tried principles of journalism, which would say, obviously, we're not going to run that because that's not really a story. That's what happens. You get to that moment where there's a decision to be made, and your identity as an organization is what helps make that decision one way or the other. Business or newspaper, news organization or profit-seeking entity. And I think that's what happened with the New York Times. Whether there was stuff regarding petrodollars or the wider context beyond that, I don't really know about that. I'm sure sure there's something to that. It sounds classic United States government type stuff, but that's not really something I know too much about.
You talked a little bit about how during the Holocaust there was the influence of German philosophy and things like that, and it seems to me that there is some kind of downstream effect from you look at scholars, and then you go to universities, and then you go eventually to the newspaper. And in this case, what I see, and maybe that's incorrect, is you have postmodernism with Derrida, Foucault, which are like French philosophers, and then they brought that to Yale is like the big center of it, and then you have downstream effects where these new theories emerge, and they are propagated through New York Times, and maybe at the time you could see that influence in the presentation of what happened with the Holocaust and during USSR, the Cuban Revolution and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about what's the 1619 project, and like why that's important, and maybe that influence that the New York Times has over people?
The 1619 project was this huge editorial initiative launched by the Times in August 2019. It was created by a journalist who worked for the New York Times Magazine called Nicole Hannah Jones. And it was basically taking the entire magazine's edition and devoting it to a single topic, which was the topic of race in America. Specifically, what they were claiming was that the United States was not born in liberty in 1776 when it declared independence from Britain. rather, it was born in the exact opposite of liberty, which is slavery. And that's where the number 1619 comes from, is the year that the first slaves were brought to the American colonies. The claim there is that, again, America's born out of slavery, but not just that. It's that all of the structures that exist today in American society are born out of slavery as well. So it's almost like you're living in the legacy of a slaveocracy, and in some ways, it is still a slaveocracy. That is the claim. So that issue of the New York Times Magazine, it really kind of traced all these, kind of played it all out, fanned out in all these different ways. So it looked at like healthcare in America being a sort of how it was an outgrowth of slave practices. Business practices in America today, accounting was sort of, they were claimed, which is completely, there's just no evidence for it, but like standard corporate accounting practices, they say, were born out of the slave plantation and ways of like keeping track of slaves and goods and stuff like that. Traffic, the way we consume sugar, they're saying all this came from American slavery. And that, again, today we're living in what is sort of the remnants of a slave society. And that is a bunch of big, huge, bold claims to make. And the problem with that is, number one, most of the people writing in that issue were not historians. They are not historians. Nicole Hannah-Jones is a journalist, of course, and she's not a historian. And number two, they had to make some really bold sort of evidentiary claims to support these conclusions. They had to bring evidence that was as big as the claim. So among them, as an example, Nicole Hannah-Jones, in her essay for the 1619 issue, wrote that the American Revolutionary War, the war that America fought to gain independence from Britain, was fought largely to preserve slavery in the colonies. And that is, by just about every single account that I've read in response to this, just not true. That was something that the New York Times' own fact checker, who they called to ask about this claim, who is a African-American woman who teaches African-American history at Northwestern University, told them on the phone that you can't say that. It's just not true. But they made the claim anyway, as they did with a number of other claims. And of course, there were some claims in there that could be supported. And you could even say, like, generally speaking, it was a worthy endeavor, or it is a worthy endeavor, to say we should examine race relations in America and the impact on slavery today. Fair enough. But when you're going to make this gigantic claim, historical claim, in not a journal of history, but a newspaper, and you are using evidence that really is unsupportable to do it, you're now on shaky ground. You're now out on a very thin limb as a journalist and as a news organization, in a place that I wouldn't want to be. It just so happens that she really caught things in a cultural moment that swung really drastically in her direction. And what you have there is like the whole corporate brand mechanism kind of whirring into action, saying, oh yeah, we got to like spin this thing out. So you've got like, the Oprah series coming out, the 1619 Oprah series, the Netflix deal, the book deal, the children's books, you name it, like it's all happening. And most damagingly, though, I think, is that it's being made into an educational curriculum for schools and colleges across America. And the problem with that, the deep problem with that, is that you are now saying that what's more important than factual accuracy is what serves our political need. It's what boosts our claim to power. And this is what you're talking about when referencing postmodernism, because this idea about truth and objectivity, it really came from sort of a postmodernist interpretation of truth. It's this notion of critical theory, which came out of the Vienna Circle in the 1930s, where the claim was that truth was not something that was an objective measurement of reality. That's not truth. For these guys, what truth was whatever serves to emancipate oppressed people. And who gets to decide who's the oppressed people? In this case, you do, the person who's doing the talking. And what that does is that it removes truth from the realm of the collective and the collaborative, where we say, as science ideally says, okay, I'm going to do an experiment, you're going to do an experiment, the third person is going to do an experiment. Let's get the more experiments, the more theory we can get in here, the better we're going to be able to approximate what really is happening, because we've got more data, we've got more analysis. Instead of that model, which I think is more or less an Enlightenment model, which, by the way, the critical race theory, like Nicole Hannah-Jones and the people that she's relied on for this stuff, they look at the Enlightenment version of truth as a function of white supremacy. Instead of that, they have adopted a critical theory of approach to truth, which is saying whatever elevates our cause to power is true. And for Nicole Hannah-Jones, it's enough to say that it serves us, that it's almost like it's this poetic notion of truth, to say it serves us and it serves the narrative, and poetically it's true, and maybe in their minds, morally it's true, that the American Revolutionary War was fought to protect slavery in the colonies. And whether or not scholars agree, well, that doesn't matter, because it's just their interpretation, right? Their interpretation versus my interpretation. And this is the postmodernist kind of flipping of the lens. Like, you go from their lens to my lens to my lens. It's just a kaleidoscope. You can just shift the lens a little bit and we get a totally different picture. And there is no reality. There's just the shifting of the kaleidoscope. That's all there is. That, I think, is a very dangerous shift. That is a paradigm shift in how we think about truth. That's something that was really alien to Western culture and Western epistemology until the appearance of the postmodernists on the scene, or maybe even a little bit before that, with the critical theory people in Austria, really creating new approaches to truth. And that's something that, I just used the term paradigm shift. That was Thomas Kuhn famously in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, where we have this idea that you have a scientific theory that says, that's Newtonian and says a bunch of things about the universe. And then you have Einstein coming along and saying, no, none of that was true. This is all now a new world. And the terms that we are employing, their meaning has changed. The definition has changed. But some people have read Kuhn to mean that the world physically, literally changed. When Einstein came along and created a new theory of the universe, the physical universe, what these people, these constructionists, they're called, they believe that the physical universe changed in that moment. And this is where you've got this idea that truth is whatever we say it is, or whatever somebody says it is, rather than saying, no, there is an objective thing out there called truth. Maybe I can't get the full truth by myself. Maybe even a million of us can't get it together, but we can get closer and closer and closer. The more collaborative spirit we bring to the endeavor, the more open we are to each other's ideas, to listening and to hearing and to thinking them through. And critically, the more willing you are to be wrong. And I think this is the real point, to say, and this is where American society's lost that ability to be wrong, to be like, oh, you know what? I made a mistake. This was not the right theory. Let's try the other guy's theory. We no longer have that ability to do that. And in the media, that's even, I think, more critical and more damaging, that we've lost that ability to say, you know what? Okay, I'm a CNN guy and I hate Fox News, but they were actually kind of right on that story. Or the opposite, I'm a Fox News diehard, hate MSNBC, but that they got a point here, right? Just to be able to consider the other point of view as more closely aligned with the objective truth. I mean, that's the keys to the kingdom, to a healthy, functional society. But we've really misplaced those keys.
Interesting. So talking a little bit about the 1619 project, a feeling that I have, and maybe that's misplaced, is that the influence that the New York Times has over public opinion has reduced over time in the past 10, 20 years. And that's because of technology. You have social media and things like that. And maybe one example is the 1619 project, even though, there is some efforts there, like really they spent a lot of money on that project. I don't know if that reflected in public opinion. Another example, and maybe I'm wrong, and I would like to hear your opinion on that and your arguments there, is regarding, how the public view China and the CCP. There weren't that many stories regarding, the Uyghurs. I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but yeah, and Uyghurs. How, this, yeah, and how they, like what happens there, and a lot of the corruption inside China, and how is that changing? Is that changing over time? And it seems that it's still like the New York Times is growing the revenue, right? But their influence is not growing, and it's like you can compare that to Microsoft in the technologies sector. They had a lot of influence in the 90s, and the revenue kept growing, but they don't have as much influence in. It seems that the New York Times is following the same path. Like their digital subscriptions is growing, but it seems that they don't have as much influence. Is that happening, or am I wrong here?
Definitely happening, for sure. We have alternate sources today. We have, we have sources that are so influential as individuals, Joe Rogan, or YouTubers, Russell Brand, with his like insane YouTube following, like 10 million, which is for sure bigger than whatever the New York Times has on YouTube. You have so many of these independent voices. And more importantly than that, you have people who are just walking away from the media and saying, no more, I don't want it anymore. And that's not just like, we tend to think of like these people as being on the fringe or being right wing or something. It's not. I have almost every week, certainly every month, people reach out to me saying, I am a lifelong New York Times subscriber, and my family are all, and my parents were. It's like a heirloom. They've handed it down generation to generation, and they said, I've canceled my subscription. I can't read it anymore. And it's not just the New York Times, it's other newspapers and magazines as well. But it's particularly with the Times. They did have revenue growth during the Trump years. I imagine that is leveling out and that it will begin to recede. They have flipped their business model so that, as many other newspapers and magazines have done. So they've moved from an advertising-based model or mixed advertising subscription model to subscription alone, because advertising on the internet is a very difficult, if not impossible, way to really make money sustainably. And so you're really relying on getting these subscribers who are going to be fired up and who are going to be willing to pay for your newspaper, because we have all been sort of conditioned to expect news for free. And not just that, we've been conditioned to expect it from 1,000 different sources. From like, if this story's over here at the Washington Post, I'll take that one. And if a different story's over here at CNN Today, I'll take that one. And the idea that I'm just going to pay for one newspaper, it's anathema to most of us. So you're thinking, well, why would I need just one newspaper? It doesn't really make sense. And the New York Times, it's sort of predicated on being the one, being number one. And that's the space I think they're trying to occupy today, not for everyone, because they're never going to do that, but for a very small subset of people who are saying, yeah, we're fired up. The New York Times is doing great stuff. They're doing the social justice stuff that we really depend on, and I can't do without it. And that very small base is where I think they are putting their cards for now. And the counter effect of that is that you kind of have to cater content to a very tiny portion of your total readership, the 3 to 4% of people who are actually paying for the content. via subscriptions. So among most Americans, I think, yes, there and the wider media ecosystem, the influence has waned and people are not as dependent. You know, if you were a novelist, I think we talked about this a little bit before we were cut off. If you were a novelist, if you were an artist, if you were a restaurateur in America, and you either were not reviewed by them or got a bad review, you're done. You game over. Go do something else. That is just not the world we live in today. Like that's just, we're so far from that. And yes, it's great to have the New York Times little bestseller badge on your book. It doesn't really matter though, to be honest. Like you can be a huge bestseller without having that badge because they can actually choose not to give it. It's not fully objective. Big surprise. Like they consider it to be an editorial property. They make subjective decisions about the bestseller list, but it doesn't matter because you can go out and sell tons and tons of books and not need that thing and not need their review. And American news consumers or global news consumers can read an incredible Substack and get all they need from that Substack for $5 a month or $0 a month if they want. And they just don't need the New York Times. They might like it, some of them, but so yes, I agree. The influence has changed completely. And can a newspaper like that survive if it doesn't have a premium on influence? I think that's the question they're going to have to face going forward as they're going to seek out how to evolve the business model. I don't think subscription is going to cut it. I really don't think that that's going to be enough to keep an organization of that size afloat, especially when they have to serve shareholders, right? And we all know with shareholders, you can't just keep the stock price where it is. That's not a success. It has to continue to go up. And either that's going to be through growth, usually it is through growth, and or profitability. I don't see how they continue to be more profitable than they are today. I see probably less profitability on the horizon. And definitely at some point with growth, it's going to plateau and it's going to start to go down, especially because we don't have the Trump effect. Trump motivated so many people to subscribe to opposing viewpoint news organizations like the New York Times. They really did well by him. They loved him, just like every other news organization out there. Now the Trump effect is gone, and they're going to have to find new ways of dealing with this. And what we're seeing is that for some, they're kind of inflecting back to the center, like CNN, reorienting itself back to the center, back to sort of just fact gathering, news gathering stuff. For the Times, I think it's a question what their fate will be. We'll see what they do. It's going to be very interesting.
Interesting. So it seems that there's a big change, and that's not only happening, in the US. I see that I'm Brazilian, and I see that in Brazil as well. Like the big institution that's called Globo in Brazil had major influence, and sometimes they favor someone on the right, sometimes they favor someone on the left. All they cared about, the party wasn't blue or red, their party was green. And it's always been green. And it's interesting because there is a growing influence of individuals, and you see with Substack, and there are famous, what you would call left-leaning journalists that are growing their influence. So, you can talk about Glenn Greenwald, who actually lives in Brazil, Matt Taibbi, and, you have podcast creators, which, they could be the equivalent of radio celebrities at the time. And, is that how is that affecting the world, and how is that affecting public opinion? And is that the reason why the New York Times, is attacking so much tech right now? It seems that the best journalists they figure out that they can go direct, and they leave the institutions. And one big example is I forgot her name. She I think helped the Barry Weiss, right? Like she left the New York Times to create her own Substack, and she can go direct. And like a lot of the times, they can make much more money than they would, working for a big institution. Is that eroding the big media institutions? Because if you're the best, why would you work for a big institution that's going downhill instead of going direct? And actually, if you care about the truth, right? Like if you're a great journalist, you would care about the truth. And it seems that going direct is much better because you're not serving necessarily, someone else's agenda, right?
I don't know how much it's eroding the big brands. When you think about for example, I forget the name of the brand, the razor brand that the guys from Warby Parker did. They did basically this sort of like D2C,
Harry's?
Right? Direct to consumer. What's it called? Yes, exactly. Harry's, right? Is Harry's really eating market share of Gillette? No, I don't think so. Not yet, at least. Maybe it is, but I wouldn't imagine so. I think it's an alternative. I think it's an alternative path for people who prefer an alternative path. The difference is that I think like D2C, right? You didn't really have D2C for consumer packaged goods or for any kind of retail before. You do now, and now we're seeing the power of it. And I think the same was true with the media. We never had any kind of D2C model aside from like very small like zines, those like homemade magazines from the 90s you would like buy at your record store or something like that. But there was never a real viable model until the internet. And I think, yes, that is why media hates the internet in part. In part, it's kind of a financial threat. Number one, nobody likes that. And number two, I think just as importantly, it's a cultural threat. Where is the cultural cachet? The media is so used to having total ownership of the cultural cachet, cultural influence. Who is calling the shots? Who is determining which are the important values in our society? All of a sudden, starting around, who knows, the late 90s, the early 2000s, that started to shift. And we started to look at tech for cues and guidance on culture, on how we should behave, how we should live, what values we live by. And you kind of shift from this approach that's more humanistic in media, which, people who are like coming out with English degrees, and now it's going over to tech, and it's not humanism anymore that matters. It is the progress of technology. It is an engineering approach to life. It is about optimizing and not about sort of the media approach, which is more, it's not about optimizing, it's about observing, it's about accepting as things are, it's about describing the world rather than, with an engineering approach, you're trying to make it better. You're prescribing a way that there's a notion that the things are objectively, there's an objective measure of what's good. In engineering, you can just measure what is better and what is worse, what's more efficient, what's less efficient, what's more effective or less. And the media really hates that. And I think that's also because the worldview is that kind of postmodernist ideal that says every viewpoint is equally valid. They don't actually live by that, of course, because they don't really accept that to be true, because they don't see conservative tech engineers in Nashville's viewpoint to be equally valid as theirs. Obviously not, but that is the kind of conceit that they live by. Whereas the alternative viewpoint from tech is saying no, there's actually an objective measure, and we can make things better in a linear fashion in progress towards something. It's this idea of of a teleology, of an endpoint, a purpose that we're working toward, which I think tech kind of has that built in a way. It may not describe exactly what that purpose is, and it may not be spiritual per se, but in the media, that definitely doesn't have that. Like the humanistic worldview is saying there's no purpose. We're just here, and let's just have fun. Let's just have a party. So I think that's a lot of it. I think those three factors of, no one wants to have their lunch eaten, and tech has been eating the media's lunch. And now it really is, right? Now Substack, which is essentially a technology company, is taking, I think, perceived market share. And again, I come back to this idea that I don't really think that they are taking market share from the New York Times, but it is some kind of perceptual threat to them. And then the cultural influence that they are losing to tech, I think, motivates a lot of animosity, and the worldview. The difference in worldview, I think, is the other piece. And the media want to be right. The media is used to being right. The media is used to proving itself right by its own means, and that's kind of what they do when they go after people. And that's what Balaji Srinivasan, when he talks about the notion of prosecutorial journalism, you're going after people. You're going after them to take them down. And the targets of these campaigns are not necessarily evil, bad, criminal people. They're often just like founders. And you think, like, what is going on here? Like, how are they so fired up? I mentioned Taylor Lorenz, like she'd gone after a founder named Steph Corey because Steph objected to this idea that she felt that the media was unfairly criticizing female founders in a way that they didn't do with male founders. And Taylor Lorenz just went nuts. And you're like, what? It was so objectionable about what Steph Corey said there. And it's nothing, has nothing to do with what she said. It has to do with who she is. And I think that's what we're seeing going on in the battle between media and tech.
Interesting. What happened there? It seemed that, before, maybe it was before 2012, there was this love relationship. You had like positive stories about Facebook and whatnot. Yeah. And the sentiment completely shifted. And the interesting part is that it seems that there are certain companies that, are targeted. There are many stories against Facebook, now Meta, but not so much is written negatively against, Twitter, Snapchat, or even TikTok, that has grown its influence, towards especially teenagers and the younger generation. What's going on there? Why so much negativity towards, Facebook?
I mean, Facebook just took all the revenue. Facebook and Google just vacuumed up all the advertising dollars that once belonged to the media. And I think it's not more complicated than that. I think that, yes, there are, of course, Facebook has to deal and has to be accountable to or has to be accountable for its own serious problems. It has very serious problems, of course. But this is something else that Balaji talks about, which is that you often get these like exposés or this like line of reporting about Zuckerberg or about name the founder and the big founder, and you get those like, this guy is evil and let's like look into him and investigate and look at his family and all that stuff. You never get that about media owners. You never ever have that about Sulzberger, the family that controls the Times, or about the Barry Diller, the guy who owns the Daily Beast. It almost never happens. And I do think it is largely, one, because the media protects its own, two, because they are threatened by what tech has done to their business models. It completely decimated them, and they're fighting back. In a way, you sort of can't blame them. Like, yeah, fight back. But it's just a bit dishonest by their own terms. That's the problem with that. It's hypocritical, and that's where people really get riled up about it. Because the one thing people don't mind when someone fights back. Of course, like you want someone to stand up for themselves and for what they stand for. But when it's done in a hypocritical means or fashion, that really gets to people and gets them angry. And I think that's what we're seeing with the media, is that we feel that it's done hypocritically because it's not honest, it's not truthful, and it's in violation of what they're preaching. It contradicts their own preaching on media ethics and also committing the same kind of so-called sins that they're accusing tech of committing. So I think that's why Facebook and Google are getting the brunt of it. Twitter, journalists love Twitter because it's good for their brands. Like that's where they build their brands. That's where they build their audiences. They have audiences. Many of them have, audiences in the six figures, 100,000 or more. Many times it's 500,000, 600,000, 700,000, 1 million people, Twitter followers. That's incredible influence. It's a great sales tool for their product, their news product, for books, or for whatever else they might be selling. So they're not going to do that. They're not going to go after Twitter. And TikTok, I think, is the real conundrum. Like, why haven't they gone after TikTok? I think that, you mentioned the Uyghurs. Like, why, hello, there's a genocide being carried out by the world's second or maybe most powerful country. Why is there not reporting on that on the front page at least once a week, if not every day? Why? I don't know. I personally think it's because, just like so many other businesses, the media sees in China an enormous marketplace that they would love to tap. They see huge potential in that enormously now wealthy country on aggregate. And they don't want to piss off the Chinese, because if you piss off the CCP, you do not get access to the market, period. That's it. It's over. It's not like India. You can like drag the Indian government through the mud and you're still going to get access to the audience, because there's not much they can do about it. In China, the New York Times did try to go into China to access the market. They created a Chinese edition of the paper. They launched it. And then they made a mistake, which is that they criticized a very high-ranking Chinese official. They wrote a story about his family's corruption. That was it. Chinese flipped the switch. No more New York Times in China. And they've been trying to dig themselves out of that hole for many years, though, since then. And you don't do that by insulting the Chinese government or the Chinese people. And I think the media sort of gets that. And they get that TikTok has ties to the Chinese government, like every single Chinese company in existence. They, by law, have to have those ties. The 2017 National Intelligence Law in China mandates every company and individual has to turn over intelligence that they have to the Chinese state if it could benefit the Chinese state or hurt the Chinese state, no matter what it is. And if they don't do it, they are in violation of Chinese law. And in some reporting that I did previously for a different story, someone said the Australian regulator of foreign investment came out and said, for our purposes, there is no more distinction between the Chinese government and private companies. There is no such thing as a private company in China anymore. And that's the same with TikTok. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company. It is very much, it is exposed to controls of the Chinese state. There are certainly, and I think there was a report about this showing that there are likely Chinese intelligence officials working at TikTok. And again, nobody wants to take that risk and get barred from the market or to have repercussions that are going to be very serious in terms of affecting your business as a news organization. Your ability to report from China or on China, it's going to be affected. And it's a mystery, though. It's still a mystery, because even when you say that, you think, but why do they still continue to parrot Chinese propaganda on very important topics like COVID? That is where I still can't quite understand it. For example, the lie that there's zero COVID in China or anything like that. The lie that in almost 2 years, China saw 4 COVID-related deaths. We're talking about in a country of over 1 billion people. 4. The neighborhood I live in didn't have as few as 4 deaths. Of course, it's just a lie. And it was eaten up, and it was repeated by the media. And every time they write a story saying, is zero COVID tenable? Is it sustainable? They're buying into the lie more because they are accepting the premise that there is such thing as zero COVID in China, and there's not. There was the Economist is a standout on this issue. They did an analysis showing that the Chinese reporting on COVID deaths was something like 12,000% wrong. They did like a statistical analysis showing that it's just literally impossible, and they're off by that insane factor. And the media nobody responded to that. Like nobody came out and said, maybe we should take a close look at these numbers and do a Pulitzer Prize winning series on how China underreported its COVID deaths by probably 5, 6, 7 orders of magnitude. But I don't know. It's insane
to it's insane to think that only one country in the whole world had 0 COVID deaths, and they magically did that. I wonder though, like you talked a little bit about money, that might be the reason why they have negative opinions around Facebook. And I wonder if it's cultural, if it's influence. And the reason why I say that is I don't see as many stories as many negative stories against YouTube, for example, right? Or and even if you look inside the Facebook organization, Sheryl Sandberg was like praised for some time, around inside, news organizations. Her image shifted a little bit lately, but it seems that it's much more about influence. I'm not 100% sure about that. And to point that out, Zuckerberg was being interviewed by Joe Rogan, right? And he was asked why, why don't you censor, certain things? And he was talking about, that they didn't amplify the New York Post story, even though they let it play out. They didn't let it be on top of newsfeed. And the reason why he does that is because of money at the end of the day, because people want to, you want to, promote what people want to see. And because that's what they want to spend time, reading or watching. So at the end of the day, the social media landscape is very competitive. And that's what he says, like TikTok is emerging and you have other companies there. And if you don't let people watch what they want to watch, you're going to lose, market. So I wonder if it's more cultural than anything else. Related to that is that, like with TikTok and even YouTube, you have a huge influence of, the newsfeed and of algorithms determining what people watch and what people don't watch. Not only that, if you search around, like, I don't know if you had that experience, but on YouTube, if you search certain topics, sometimes it's really, really hard to find because it seems that they don't want you to find that information. Even Google, it's crazy. And Google drives a lot of the traffic, a lot of the eyeballs that we see. I wonder what you think about that and how that relates to, Chris Cox, when you started Facebook, I worked at Facebook a long time ago. He had, his first day speech, he talks about how the medium is the message, right? And with TikTok, you have these these videos that are served by AI algorithms that, you're served the next video and the next video and the next video. And sometimes you can, as you mentioned, you don't expose people to certain opinions. So you don't expose people to the fact that there's a war in Yemen or what's happening in China. What do you think is the influence of, now of media companies on people's public opinions? And is that going to grow or is that going to change over time? And just, yeah, want to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, well, I definitely think that we're seeing, on the one hand, with social media, it feels more grassroots and more bottom up, like, what the mob thinks influences the individual. But on the other hand, the Hunter Biden laptop story shows you just how top down it really actually is, because yeah, maybe there's some business interest there showing people what they want to see. I would think that the former vice president's son and possibly soon to be president's son doing crack cocaine with prostitutes is something that everyone wants to see, even if they don't want to admit it. And that would have been, and just, the engagement rates on that in October would have been insane. Like if we're just looking from a business standpoint, you'd think, well, get it out there. I mean, there's not a bigger story than that in that moment. Like there literally could not have been. But what Zuckerberg also spoke about with Rogan was that the FBI got involved. The FBI came to Facebook and said, be careful. There is Russian propaganda about, and, you might want to, who knows what they really said, right? But he admitted that much. My guess is that that's not the full picture. My guess is that there was much more coordination on top level, not just from the FBI, but from, people who are associated with Biden. Biden's a powerful political figure, even if he wasn't in office at that moment. And they played the game cleverly. And my guess is that they, Facebook might have been thinking that Biden would be a shoo-in or was more likely to win. And you want to go with the power. You want to go where the power is, because you don't want to get regulated. You don't want a political backlash when Democrats are in power. And you are just making the smart move for your business that happens also to be a political decision to essentially censor a piece of content, even if you're not actively censoring it like Twitter did. But I think at the end of the day, if you're not allowing it to be boosted, you are making a decision to not allow it to rise to the surface in a way that it otherwise would have. So we're still seeing top-down control. We're still seeing an ability for individuals, one person, to call one person and make a decision that affects 1 billion people, which is quite insane, because with a newspaper, you never had that kind of scale. You did have JFK calling the publisher of the New York Times during the Bay of Pigs crisis, where the United States tried to invade Cuba and failed, and saying, or it was in advance, and saying, don't run the story, and Kennedy saying, don't run the story, and the publisher saying, okay, and a few tens of millions of people in America didn't get the story. Now, when that decision is made by Facebook or by Twitter, we are talking about billions of people who are affected, because they're not getting a story on a global scale. It's really unprecedented in that way. I do think that is a form of propaganda. I do think that is a form of information control. It's very savvy. And, Zuckerberg didn't come onto that show and say that because he suddenly felt honest. He felt suddenly he had a need to get it all out. Of course not. He went onto that show to achieve some sort of tactical objective. And maybe that was, okay, now that the threat is over, we can sort of just come clean, and it was just a misunderstanding, and it's not going to happen again. Don't worry about it. It was a unique situation, and the FBI, and you've got this kind of like this muddle of explanations. And this is something the CCP is actually very good at doing. The CCP, according to a source of mine who's an intelligence figure, he says that the CCP doesn't try to just shut down a story. They don't just try to like remove it from the internet, because they know that's not really possible. It's going to get out. What they try to do is just kind of round off the edges, like just take the sting out of the story, or insert like 5 other narratives at the same time that make you think, wait, what? Which is it, this or is it that, or is it that, or is it that? We don't know anymore. And that's what happened with COVID. and the question of whether this came from a lab. They put so much misinformation and disinformation into the system that it's taken researchers like me and like people I know, and journalists and professional researchers and the whole like legion of people 2 years just to figure out what's the basic facts here. What are the basic facts? Is it this genetic sequence? Was this genetic sequence the same as this genetic sequence? Why did they take it out of the database? Did they take it out of the data? We're just sorting through the basic facts. We can't even get to a point of analysis yet because it's such a tangle. It's such a mess of information. And that is an incredibly effective tactic when you want to control a narrative, because you're creating a smokescreen. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing with the Zuckerberg Rogan thing. It's like, let's just say a bunch of stuff. FBI came and there was Russian propaganda and we regret it and we're sorry, but we're not because it was right, but it was wrong. And you're like, okay, whatever, fine. Zuckerberg, just that's good enough. I think that's really the intent there. And I think that's what it did achieve. So I do think the level of ability to control the narrative is still enormous. I think, though, for people who are really interested in digging into an issue, you can start to sort through it, and you're going to believe what you're going to believe anyway. That's where the narrative control can't reach those kinds of people who say, I don't care what you're telling me. You guys withheld that story because it was good for you and it was good for your political buddies, period. And I think there are a lot of people who do think like that right now, and they have a home in the media for them in various places. Some of them are more on the fringe, some of them more in the center. But I think enough people just say, well, yeah, of course they did it for that reason. And, they just accept it, which is sad, but true.
It seems that there is some kind of backlash, even for COVID, for the longest time, like there was this narrative that it didn't come from a lab, and like really early on, like if you did a little bit of research, you could see, it probably came from a lab. And it's interesting, that early on, there were videos of people falling on the streets, and there is research showing that, there was propaganda of, the CCP had a bunch of bots basically, saying that, you had to lock down. And that was specifically towards Italy when Italy, started having it. But there is some backlash, like you can see with the New York Post article with COVID and its origins, and even with Alex Berson, who got his Twitter account reinstated, which he got pushed out, according to him, because the administration, the government pushed Twitter to basically block him and remove him from Twitter. But it seems that there is a backlash. Do you think that's going to continue? Like, do you think institutions like Facebook can still control, like let's say 10 years from now, where, you have crypto, you can have decentralized networks, you can have, more competition. Do you think that control will still happen? And you can clearly see that, at the time Facebook did it, and it might be because, for them, like money-wise, it made sense, but there is a lot of backlash from, it seems, people in general. Like, do you think that's going to still be the case where, these big corporations like cut out a story, and people still see them, like, don't see the story about, the son doing crack or whatever? Do you think that's still going to happen in the next 5-10 years?
No, I don't think so. I think we are moving more towards decentralization. I think we are probably going to see at some point the sort of a fragmentation of the social network. So, being able to sort of port your social graph, I think that will be the big leap. And when that happens, and you can just take your social graph with you to any social media platform you want, or create your own one, which we're not that far from it. I know the guys at Koi, which is a blockchain company, they're working on stuff surrounding some of these issues of like decentralizing social media and giving people the ability to build their own networks, which I think that is key, because when you look at Twitter and you just like scroll through Twitter and you're just like, all right, it's like the soapboxes. People would like go to a public square and stand on a soapbox and give a little speech, and like generally that would all be roughly about the same topic. Maybe it'd be like politics, maybe a bit of religion, but like you go on Twitter and like this guy's like shouting about like you should buy silver. The next guy's like shouting about abortion, and like this woman's like talking about trans stuff, and the next person's talking about like BMXing, and the next person's talking about like how much they like hate like dandruff shampoo, like just like the most insane stuff. And you're like, this shouldn't all be in the same place. We're speaking. It's the story of Babel, right? We're here speaking thousands of different languages. Even if we're all communicating technically in English, we're all using different value systems to communicate what we mean, and it's incommensurable. We're not communicating with one another because there's too many people with too many different kinds of viewpoints in the same space, when they have nothing in common with each other and no common purpose to be there. It's totally unnatural. It's like there's never a point in your life where you're just, unless you're in a stadium filled people for a sporting event, 100,000 people or something. But even then, you're there for a common reason. Like you're there for the game and you're supporting that team or that team, but you're not all there to like just express your opinion. Imagine 100,000 people in a stadium and everyone's there to just like shout about the thing that they happen to think about at that moment. It's just the most insane thing. And Twitter, I think, is like this, I think, this pivot point for social media and for culture, where we're going to say that just is not the model. We have to recognize that Twitter can like roll out features till the end of time. It's not going to fix the problem. The problem is that people are not gathered for a common purpose. So I think that is where the future is going to be in networks that are dedicated more to people with common interest and common purpose, that can be together in their own little space, and they don't have to like shove their values in the faces of other people who don't believe the same thing. It's just not, I think, a healthy way to approach that problem. And with that kind of decentralization in the social media, I think it'll be roughly the same thing with the news. Like you can have your own little burrow, you can have your own little bailiwick for information in general, and that might be part of it is a news feed and part of it is a social feed, but it's really more about common interests and values that gathers people rather than format. So right now, like your Twitter people gather on Twitter for the Twitter format, and yes, of course, your following affects like what you see and etc. But you're seeing just still way too much. So I think that's kind of the future, and I do think that gives entities like government or like huge corporations less of an ability to affect that many people at one time. Because the Hunter Biden thing is like, that's that moment where, you just slam on the brakes. Like, as we were saying before, this kind of propaganda effort, which is what it was, affecting that many people, like that size, that portion of the global population all at one time is just too much. It's too much control for any system to allow. So I think we're probably going to be moving away from that model and towards something that is just much more organic, much more healthy, and sustainable for the human mind than what we have today, which is just like we're at a state of almost like psychic death. Like you just cannot continue anymore. It's your brain is going to explode out of your head if you're on Twitter too long. Like I can feel it when I'm on Twitter. I'm just like, what is going on here? How many opinions do I need to hear about how many topics at one time? It doesn't make any sense. And then to add your little thing to it feels just even more insane. So like the wise course of action here would be to stay quiet and then to remove myself from the insanity rather than to contribute. Yeah, we all continue to contribute because we know we've kind of been engineered to do that.
Awesome. So last question. What do you think are the most important stories that are being hidden from the general public that the general public is not seeing right now?
I think it's, specifically, I think people are not really getting a story of of the pandemic. Where did it come from? How did it emerge? What kind of mistakes were made on a systems level? Should we have locked down? Should we not have locked down? What would have happened if we hadn't? Those are stories that are not getting told. This is the most important event of all of our lifetimes, aside from personal stuff. It is a public event. There's just nothing that even can compare. 10 million people are dead. Our lives were put on a pause for 2 years for this thing. It didn't have to be that way. What resulted was a result of our perception being shaped. That's the crazy thing when you think about COVID. It was, I think you mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration, where you had top level scientists, scholars from Yale, Harvard, Stanford coming on saying, don't lock down. Locking down is going to be destructive and damaging for everybody. And it wasn't even considered as part of the discourse. It was just thrown out and bulldozed away like garbage and made into this toxic thing. And we were led to believe that locking down was the only possible way to flatten the curve and to do all these other things that we got these buzz terms in our head. Of course, you got to flatten the curve. Of course, you got to keep people away from each other. Of course, you have to wear a mask in public. Of course, but you don't necessarily get to consider the alternative view, which is that maybe more lives would have been saved had we not locked down. Maybe we would have been healthier had we not locked down. Maybe the virus wouldn't have evolved as quickly as it had we not done that. So I think COVID is the one right now because we all want to forget it. That's part of it. Is that the natural human instinct. We want to just move away from the traumatic event and forget it. And the media is saying, okay, yeah, sure, we'll let you forget that because we are the ones who fucked it up. We are the ones who basically served as a pipeline for government messaging rather than challenging the government on so much of this stuff, and including on the origin of the pandemic, crucially. That's a big one. The Uyghur story, that's huge. I mean, there is an actual genocide being perpetrated today, right now. People in camps. We don't know how many there are. We don't know where they are. We don't know what's being done to them. We don't know who's doing it to them. We don't know anything. I talked earlier about the Holocaust the Nazis committed in the 1930s and 40s, and we're sort of watching the same thing happen today. That's an enormous story, and it's not being told. And, I think there is just a general notion of like how the world works, the world around us works that we don't really get access to, how decisions are made that we don't get access to. People talk a lot about the Jeffrey Epstein thing, which is, why did that just go away? That like, who did he work for? Where did he come from? In and of itself, it's not that big a story because it's localized. But the fact that it just kind of went away, the fact that no one really looked into who he was, that the questions weren't asked, that's the bigger story about media. It's like, what role does media play in all this? How is media, where does it interface with government? Where does it interface with the big corporations that own the media and people in power around the world who are able to influence media decision-making? I think that's another sort of meta story that no one in media would ever tell because they'll be fired and blacklisted forever. So I think those are just a few of them. There's many more, of course, but those are the ones that come to mind for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. And
thank you, Giuliano.
Wrap it up here. Thank you.